Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? I've been quiet for a while, but that's because I've been kicking ass on a new book for Raventail Publishing, as well as dealing with the usual holiday shenanigans and some unscheduled visits to the hospital. I've been looking at download numbers, and it appears as though everyone is burned out on the black, which is fine. But it means I want to shake things up a little. So, how about a book you've never heard before? On New Year's Day, I'll be launching the first episode of Neptune's Scars, the follow-up novel to the Derelict saga. Many of you found me because of those books, and while it's been a Patreon exclusive for quite a while, it's time to share the podcast version. So be looking for that next week. Until then, be safe, have a great holiday, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 10 of The Black, Evolution. Chapter 16. Shauna stood near the blast door and peered at the hastily painted sign. The word Containment had been printed in a clumsy, childish hand, the crimson letters running over a partially scraped-away sign reading Quarantine. Shauna glanced at Jay, a question on her lips. "Containment is much more precise," he said in Elmer Fudd's voice. His nose grew and shrunk as though he were switching between himself and a human version of Fudd. "Quarantine is what happens when you get infected." She found herself nodding. "I see what you mean." Neil snapped his fingers. "Containment isn't more precise. It's more about function than precision." Jay made a farting noise. "How do you figure that, Doc?" Ignoring Jay's slip into Bugs Bunny's voice, Neil raised his hands as if it were elementary. "Containment is as precise in function as it is in name." From behind her, Kate said, "It doesn't matter if it doesn't perform the function. It might as well be called security joke." "A security joke," Neil corrected her. "Oh, fuck off already," Kate said. Shauna turned to look at her boss. Kate had eschewed her lab coat for a black blouse and slacks. Her skin appeared creamy and smooth in the contrast. "You changed." "Of course I did. It's a party." "Yeah, a meet and greet," Jay said. "An old friend is waiting for you." "Don't forget the new guy," Neil said. "He's very interested in meeting you." "More like eating her," Jay snickered. Kate put her hands on her hips. "Stop that. Be nice to her. They're secure," she said, and pointed to the blast door. The heavy steel suddenly turned transparent, as if it had been a mirage all along. Beyond where the blast door had been, a large glass and steel enclosure housed a dented and aging oil barrel, the initials PPE practically glowing from one side. "Not that one," Kate said, grabbing the back of Shauna's head and forcing her to gaze at the oversized glass box containing a large oblong tank. The tank's surface looked as though it had been patch-welded repeatedly, uneven seams covering damage that had occurred while it was being moved, or maybe it was damaged from the inside. "See," Kate said, letting go of Shauna's head. "They're safe, but that storage tank? That's our friend Marie in there." The storage tank marked Taub vibrated on its metal stand, the glass surrounding it quivering. A fine mist of dust erupted from the weld seams, and a line of liquid rose through a gap in the weld. The liquid streamed across the tank before breaking into dozens of tendrils. She could hear the sound of crunching chip bags, or maybe it was frying bacon. The thick liquid broke the welds, dissolving them as though they were organic instead of metal, and spawned hundreds of more tendrils. Some lightened slightly and rose from the tank's surface, each sprouting sharp talons. They dipped and bent and punched holes in the metal. More and more M2 leaked through, quickly surrounding the tank and obscuring it from view. Shauna stood, stunned, her body feeling like she'd been dropped in icy water. "It's okay," Kate said from her elbow. Shauna turned to look at her. The scientists Sclera and Iris had both turned to the color of dead stars. The orbs spun in their sockets, tiny tentacles squirming from the corners of Kate's eyes. "Marie just wants to thank you." Her voice had become thick as though she were drowning. A talon extruded from Kate's chest and swung toward Shauna. Shauna sat up in bed, her heart thumping in her ears. Catfish let out a snore and she flinched, her hand immediately rising as if to strike him. She pulled up at the last second, her fear leading to confusion. She could just make out the shape of his body in the darkness before he rolled over on his side, his hand reaching for nothing. Out of breath, she buried her head in her hands. She'd had nightmares ever since that first night on the lifeboat, but that had been a bad one. The worst. The nightmares usually included M2 rolling over Leaguer like a tidal wave. Only in her dreams, the fire she started didn't destroy the living oil slick. In those, the creature put out the fire by drowning the flames. Its eye stalks then turned as one to look at her. No, look into her, their dead gaze swallowing her. But this was worse. After seeing the containment area, she shouldn't have been surprised. She sighed and slowly lay back down, doing her best not to bump Catfish. She held her hands together across her belly, fingers tapping in a nearly silent beat, her heart rate eventually slowing to match it. Catfish grumbled and readjusted his arm, but he was still asleep. At least she hadn't woken him. She traced the edge of his elbow, the lines nearly invisible in the darkness. "I should have told you," she thought. "You asked and I said I was fine, and now I don't know how to tell you." During her tour, she'd followed Jay and Neil to the elevator, and once it was underway, she'd noticed a tremor in Jay's hands. "You feeling okay?" Jay looked at her with a puzzled expression that slowly transformed into an embarrassed grin. "Always. Just have to take a few deep breaths." The elevator dinged, and Shauna understood exactly what he meant. The facility's bottom level was nothing like the engineering or lab levels. Instead of looking well-maintained and secure, the south wall had developed a slight bow. A trickle of water flowed down the wall from a crack in the steel and concrete foundation. "Come on," Neil said. Shauna continued staring at the crack and noticed the constant buzz of the lights. The room wasn't nearly as bright as the lab or engineering levels. The fact it wasn't painted all white had something to do with it, but the concrete floor, aged and water-stained from ancient muck, seemed to dull the light. She knew it was an optical illusion, but it still gave her a shiver. Unlike the lab and engineering levels, the containment level didn't have an airlock. Slabs of metal, sheets of aluminum, panes of incredibly thick glass, bundles of rebar, and sacks of concrete created a maze leading from the blast door to a large structure near the back wall. The steel on that wall gleamed as though polished, and the glass windows provided viewports into the room. Shauna pointed with a slightly shaking finger. "Is that—" Her words trailed off into silence. "Yeah," Jay said. "It's where they are." Neil glared at Jay before flicking his eyes to hers. "If you don't want to see it, you don't—" She forced herself to smile. "No, I'm fine. I just needed this second." "God hates a coward," Jay muttered, and walked to the containment enclosure. Shauna saw that Neil was about to tell her the same thing again and decided to step forward before he could get it out. If she heard him say that again, she might take him up on it. But if she didn't see for herself and prove that things were safely corralled, she wouldn't be able to sleep again. Her heart rate hadn't increased, and neither had her breathing. Instead, they were both slowing, her body numbing with every step. She kept her eyes on the floor before her, not daring to look through the approaching windows. After reaching the heavy hatch separating the rest of the room from the containment tank, she stood still for a moment and tried to regain her composure. The fear had been ready to jump in, rule her, and leave her screaming and crying on the floor. Neil dragged his feet slightly as he walked to join her. She chuckled nervously. The man was smart enough to try and not spook her. "The hatch," he said, "is something they got from the Space Center, or so I'm told. Scrap or something. Was the best we could do, although Moore is working on something better." "What about the glass?" Neil shrugged. "Same kind of stuff you'd get for a large aquarium. Should be able to handle a lot of stress. Again, Moore is working on something better." Shauna gestured to the surplus construction supplies. "What happened here?" "Didn't realize how bad the water damage was, and Moore had to put M2 somewhere. All those supplies?" Neil shook his head. "Those are for the walls. This place is leaking, and they will be plugging holes in it while they can." "Jesus." Shauna saw a pattern on the wall and blinked. "What is that?" "Det cord," Neil said. "Part of Moore's final solution protocol." He pointed to the containment enclosure. "Thermite and Semtex. Should create a dual-purpose wave of destruction. Shockwave detonates any M2, and the thermite burns it to a crisp." "Nice." Shauna walked around the hatch and to the side while keeping her eyes in front of her. She stood there for a moment with the viewport in her peripheral vision. Something moved. Her heartbeat rose for a moment before she turned her head and peered inside. The storage tank from Ben Taub sat inside a large glass housing atop a thick sheet of steel. The glass wasn't crystal clear, appearing as though it were slightly fogged. Haphazard blisters riddled the tank's surface. Something inside had been pushing against its prison. and it was making headway. She swallowed hard. Neil, how long has it been trying to get out? The scientist scratched at his head. Since the tank was transferred from Ben Taub, which happened a day after the incident. They had a hell of a time getting it down here. The cargo lift had been frozen stiff and they had to get it fixed first, so the storage tank sat topside, rigged with all the incendiaries Moore could find. He shrugged. I'm guessing it's been trying to get out since it became trapped. I feel like I've been lied to, Shauna said. I thought Moore said this entire facility had been retrofitted. It was, well over a decade ago, and that was mainly to shore up the maintenance level. We had to add all the network lines and new sensors at the last second, still working out the kinks. He'd walked from the other side of the hatch to stand with them, but even so, this place was never designed for something like M2. She noticed several instruments connected to the glass enclosure. Are those sensors? Jay nodded and said, Seismic. Alert security if M2 gets lively. And how lively is it? She asked. You don't want to know, Neil said. Swinging her gaze to the smaller of the two housings, her breath hitched. There it was, the barrel. The stamped initials PPE stared at her in silent accusation. The letters looked odd, as though the ink had been unevenly spread. Then she realized the barrel's surface was warped and covered in blisters similar to those on the Ben Taub tank. M2, Shauna said to no one. She had filled and taken samples from that barrel and discovered a life form. Trapped inside the 30-liter barrel was the only remaining link to the creature Leaguer had drilled into, and the last sample they had of the original strain. She pressed her hands against the glass and leaned close enough for her nose to touch. She remembered the oil sample in Leaguer's lab moving off the table and coming after her. Thomas had saved her, but that's how it had all begun. No, she thought. JP getting infected was how it began, and you know it. That was more true than she wanted to admit. More than 100 people on Leaguer had died because of the liquid organism inside that barrel. The substance had tested as an amazingly pure hydrocarbon, an oil so sweet it would take almost zero refinement. Fate's famous bait and switch had left humanity vulnerable to something otherworldly, something that shouldn't exist. How active is the barrel? Active enough, Jay said, although less so than the storage tank. I'm guessing that may be because it's much lower in volume. Do we know how much liquid is inside the tank? Jay and Neil exchanged a glance. Shauna suddenly felt as though she'd discovered a deep fear of theirs. Attempted measurements have been inaccurate, Neil admitted. The liquid is moving. In changing form, Jay said. That's not helping us. Best we can guess is between 250 and 300 liters. Shauna's eyebrows raised in shock, her face paling. 300 liters? Worst case scenario, Neil said. Absolute worst case. Based on what? How much material was in the storage tank? Jay wiped his sleeve across his chin as if to scratch an itch. I guess I mean how much we think was in there, assuming fundamental physics hold. Jay, Neil said, you can't break conservation of matter. As we know it, but those things, he said, pointing at the two containment enclosures, don't seem to have much trouble breaking understood laws. Neil opened his mouth to reply but dropped his head in grudging agreement. Speaking of physical laws, do we know how much damage they're doing to their metal cages? Jay's face lit with an apologetic smile. We wish. Was that why she was awake now? Knowing they couldn't guarantee M2's imprisonment no matter what they did? That without her, the thing never would have made it to land? Was it the fear of the creature's inevitable escape? Or was it guilt for Marie Krieger's death? Shauna was an accomplice. Unwitting to be sure, but an accomplice just the same. Nothing would change that. The others who died at HAL and Ben Taub, that was on her for deciding to send the barrel for testing without a more specific warning. But that had been before she knew what it was and what it could do. M2 was trapped. The barrel and storage tank were still secure. Neil said they were monitored 24/7 with armed guards, and no blind spots in coverage were allowed. Security monitored motion and vibration readings for spikes or signs of metal fatigue, although no one knew the actual readings. Moore wasn't sharing that information. Catfish said something in his sleep. Suddenly cold, she pulled the blanket up to her neck and rolled over. He twitched slightly as she draped an arm around his shoulder, his body stiffening before relaxing again. Hugging his warm body, she shook off the remnants of the nightmare and fell back asleep. Chapter 17. Catfish's eyes flipped open at the sound of an alarm, and he sat up in confusion, his messy mop of hair falling into his eyes. It took him a moment to determine where the sound was coming from. Something caught his waking eyes, and he swung his head. It was the TV. Instead of the guide channel or a specific program, a notice blinked on the screen. Breakfast is at 0630 through 0715. Lab and engineering work hours begin at 0730. Have a good day. The message remained, but the TV had stopped its alert sound. What the hell? Catfish rubbed at his eyes. A hand pressed gently against his back, and he turned like a zombie to peer down at Shauna. A tangled cocoon of sheets wrapped her naked body, leaving her bare from the breasts up. Hi. Hi, she said, her cheeks blushing slightly. Is it time to be awake? Yeah. I think Orwell's thought police knew the moment I woke up. He shook his head. I'm too tired to be creeped out by that. He lay back down next to her, one arm draping over her belly. She nestled into him, and he kissed her cheek. Is this awkward? Shauna blinked at him. Is it? No, he laughed. Thought it would be, but it's not. She smiled. No, she said, kissing his nose. It's not. Even as tired and sore as he was, he felt different somehow. Yesterday, everything seemed futile, but not today. Am I really that shallow? I just needed to get laid to find hope? He shook his head. What? She asked. Just stupidity, he said. Fuck breakfast. Let's just stay here and sleep. No, Shauna said. What time did the TV say it was? He yawned again. 0600. No one should be awake at this hour. Catfish, millions of people in this city are awake right now. Exactly, he said. And imagine how few road rage incidents there would be if they got more sleep. I give up, she said, smacking him with the pillow. I need to get dressed and hit my trailer. To what? Change clothes or shower? Both, she said. Catfish pouted. Was hoping we could shower together. She laughed while buttoning her jeans. In there? I doubt you'll fit in that damn thing. Shit, you're right. Oh well, not a bad idea, though. She planted a kiss on his cheek and grinned. I'll be back soon. Better be ready for breakfast when I am, because I'm hungry. Hungry for... He let the words trail off and leered at her. Shauna blushed. Food, she said, and mock punched him in the stomach. Hurry, I'm hungry too. She left the trailer, and it immediately felt as empty as it had been before last night. With a sigh, he crouched to the shower. As he stepped into the tiny cubicle, so crowded he could barely move without slamming his elbows into the sides, he turned the tap to H and immediately regretted it. Cold water jetted down on his bare shoulders, every pore of his skin turning to goose flesh. Shivering and cursing, he held himself as best he could while he waited for the water to warm. He didn't have long to wait. Once the jets reached a temperature high enough to produce steam, he fought to keep all of his body in the water at once. It wasn't possible. As quickly as he could, he shampooed his hair, soaped himself down, and rinsed. 3-minute shower. That's all he could stand this morning. Maybe he should ask more if the project's barracks, the mostly abandoned building where the HAL team slept, had community showers, because this was ridiculous. He wrapped a towel around his head and rapidly rubbed the excess moisture from his skin. As humid as the air was outside, he would probably have a damp shirt for the rest of the day, especially since it would take several hours for his hair to completely dry. Shivering and wishing he'd turned the heat on, he dressed himself, while icy beads of water continued rolling down his back from his wet hair. Damn, it was cold. Errant droplets sprinkled on the trailer's carpet, but he didn't notice. Once dressed, he crushed back into what passed for the living room, and the table caught his eye. The pot, the alcohol, the vape, and the cigarettes were all still there, untouched. Catfish sighed, cracked the seal on the value pack of lighters, and put 2 in his jeans pockets. He hoped Moore knew he'd be carrying those with him at all times. In truth, the chances of the lighters being helpful were damn near nil, but they were a nice security blanket until he managed to create something better. Like she'd ever allow that, he said. He was sure Moore's people had run all sorts of psychological hoodoo tests on them, profiled them, and had conclusions about what he and the other team members would do in certain situations. Moore might know he would destroy the entire facility if given half a chance. Maybe one of the reasons he hadn't been invited into the lab area was that she was afraid of what he would do. Then again, she allowed him lighters and did the same for Shauna. Moore was complicated. Either she was playing a game he had yet to figure out, or she truly wanted them protected from a possible mishap. Or maybe, just maybe, she's insane, Catfish mumbled to himself. That was a possibility. Only question was whether she was like this before the M2 incidents or after. Maybe the sight of that liquid, alive and dead at the same time, and the horrible things it could do, tore something apart inside, and now she warred with two personalities, one that wanted to do her job, and the other that wanted to do the same thing and nuke the creatures before they threatened anyone. He shook away the thought. None of it mattered right now. Shauna would be back any minute, and he wanted to make sure he was ready. His stomach gurgled and growled as though it were trying to consume him from the inside, but there was something more important than food. In a little over an hour, he'd be locked inside the engineering floor, while she was in the lab. He would be protected by multiple steel walls and UV light. To study M2, a creature that was killed by that very same light, Shauna and her team had only a wall of glass and steel to protect them from the canister's confines. If the creature got loose from its containment shells or the samples somehow broke through their barriers, Shauna would be facing the things head on. He'd be powerless to help if anything happened. I'd be stuck on the outside with no way in, he thought. Not that it would matter if Moore went ahead and just flash-fried everyone to ensure M2 didn't escape the facility. In light of that, he had to cherish every moment he had with Shauna, every meal, every word, every touch. Either one of them could die later today. Either one of them could just disappear, never to be seen again. That was the reality now. That was how things would be until the project ended. "Hey," Shauna called from outside. "You ready?" "Be there in a sec." He strode to the table, picked up the vape, smiled at it, and broke open a carton of cigarettes. He placed the liberated pack into his pocket without unzipping the plastic strip. He'd open it later, he was sure of it. But right now, the hard, rectangular container of 20 dust sticks felt just as reassuring as the touch of Shauna's hand on his. After a more subdued breakfast than the day before, Moore waited for them at the commissary door. She was dressed in all black, her pale face appearing to glow in the contrast. "Mr. Stanley," she said. "Catfish." "Yes, Catfish." Her thin smile twitched in annoyance. "It's time for you to see the doctor." He furrowed his brows. "For what?" "I believe to get you off those," she said, a long finger pointing at the crutches, "and into a walking boot." "About time," he said, trying not to show how much the foot already ached. He'd been afraid to take too many of the pain pills, but he'd maxed out on the anti-inflammatories for all the good they were doing him. After saying goodbye to Shauna in the elevator, Givens appeared from an adjoining hallway, his face set in his typical bored expression. "You taking me to the dock?" The man nodded but didn't speak. He pointed to the main door, and Catfish followed him through, the crutches making his pace slower than the soldiers. Givens led him to another golf cart, and Catfish raised an eyebrow. "The surgeon is here?" Givens nodded. "You getting in or you want a crutch?" With a shrug, he got into the passenger seat after stowing his crutches. "Onward, James." "Fuck you," Givens muttered, and put the cart in drive. They weaved through several supposedly abandoned buildings until they reached a 4-story complex with a caduceus on the side of it. Givens parked in the handicapped space and shuffled out. "Hey," Catfish said, "we don't have a sticker." Givens looked amused. "So, you're the only cripple on the spaceport right now?" "Meaning what?" "Meaning you have a little hospital all to yourself. This puppy," Givens said, pointing to the building, "was never open to the public. Not meant to be either. At least not anymore." "This is insane," Catfish said to himself. The spaceport had been closed and in limbo for years, yet it had a hospital? When he made it inside, he finally understood. The building's facade may have been complete, but the clinic was barely finished, and appeared as though a single surgery room had been brought to completion. He hardly remembered anything about coming off the plane and being whisked straight into a medical facility, but that's what must have happened. When he awoke, he'd been in a guarded room that was not in this building. 2 nurses and a doctor awaited them in the unpainted lobby. They took x-rays. They prodded and poked. They warned him about overdoing it. They told him not to remove the boot unless he was going to sleep, and even then he had to wear a brace to keep his ankle from moving. Did he understand? "Here are some pills. Be a good boy. Now get the hell out." The boot's hard plastic crunched on a few kicked-up pieces of gravel, and Givens glanced at him as they returned to the golf cart. You ready to work now? Givens asked. Already was. Catfish peered up at the soiled cotton sky. More rain? Who gives a damn? Hey, about what we talked about yesterday? Catfish turned and peered at him. What about it? How big of a boom? In the few hours before work was halted yesterday, he and Givens had written down requirements for a weapon. Fortunately, it appeared they had plenty of material to print nearly as many prototypes as they could imagine. I think we're looking for 2 sticks of dynamite worth. I think that will puncture whatever M2 tries to grow, but would probably scatter it all over the goddamn world. Doubt it would have done much to what we saw at Ben Taub, Givens said with a shake of his head. Took a couple of oxygen tanks worth of explosion. The golf cart squeaked and rattled as Givens drove it down the pockmarked, uneven concrete. Catfish looked out over the fields and listened to the drones constantly landing and taking off before beginning their training sorties. Boom. He wanted a big boom, and he wanted it portable. Moira had told him she wanted something easy to make, something they could 3D print, rather than waiting for large manufacturing facilities, although he imagined it was mainly to keep the project a secret. Fewer people involved in the weapon's creation meant fewer possible leaks. Catfish imagined Moore would have a fit if he suggested they bring in outside help. He had some ideas about that, but it would take another conversation with the Dragon Lady, which was not something he looked forward to. Big boom. How to create a big boom. He supposed they could print something spherical with the same basic characteristics as a frag grenade. He'd want to test different timing mechanisms for the trigger, but it might work. You got any grenades on base we can look at? Hopefully dud ones? Givens laughed. I'm sure we can find something. What do you need, frag, pineapple, flashbangs? Frag. I think it needs to be spherical. Shit, the soldier said. You know your grenades. Too many video games. They left the main road, such as it was, and returned to the facility. After parking in the grass, Givens grabbed the crutches from the back. We'll keep them here in case you need them, Givens explained. Oh, okay. He didn't like the sound of that. In case he needed them? In case of what? If he lost his foot to testing an explosive? Catfish was learning to walk with the boot now, the rocking motion becoming more and more natural. He tried to fight it at first, attempting to force the boot to act like a foot or push it in the right direction. But that's not how it was supposed to function. Instead, you just had to let it do the work and have some trust. By the time they reached the engineering level, Catfish's foot was letting him know just how unhappy it was. Fortunately, the pain was below a 5. Annoying as hell, but workable. Givens left Catfish alone in the lab while he procured some dummy explosives. At least Catfish hoped like hell they'd be duds. Otherwise, his day was about to get a lot more interesting. After logging in, Catfish looked up information about explosives and metal tensile strengths. It was going to be a long day of researching and designing. Then he'd have to simulate the explosions and let the computer take out much of the guesswork. This was going to take a while. He hoped Moore realized that. Otherwise, she'd be deeply disappointed.